there's one part of the book writing process that most authors find both exhilarating and terrifying, it's getting feedback. There is no feeling so rewarding as realizing that you have a full draft, that you could hand it off to someone and see what they think. But unfortunately, there are times in the writing and revision process when getting feedback is not only not helpful, it can actually be pretty harmful. And that's why today I want to continue our 4-part series on revision by discussing when to get feedback and when not to get feedback. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. It is no wonder that the process of getting feedback can cause both excitement and panic. On one hand, congratulations on having enough of a draft that you actually have something to get feedback on. That is so exciting, and you deserve every bit of praise for what you have done. Most people never even start. So if you have even gotten a significant way into your manuscript, you do have a celebration in order. But at the same time, I find that most of us have at least a little bit of pent-up trauma from our school days. We have all gotten back drafts that were just bleeding with red ink, and oftentimes that can really add to this sense that we're not really sure what we're doing here, whether it's a safe place to be, whether we're really moving ourselves forward, and most importantly, whether we should actually trust the feedback that we get. And that's why today I wanted to give your 3rd part in the 4-part series on revising on this YouTube channel, podcast, and our blog by talking about getting feedback. What I find is that most people will jump straight to feedback even before they have gotten feedback from themselves. And that's why I want to talk about exactly what this can look like as you move through the revision process. I want to make sure that as you are moving forward with your draft, that you are spending your money wisely, spending your time wisely, and making sure that your effort is going to be as efficient as possible. Now, before we dive into all of that, I want to give you a little mindset piece just to noodle on as you are working through how you want to approach the revision stage. And that is, whenever you are tempted to seek feedback, whether from friends and family, beta readers, or a professional editor, I want you to really ask yourself, is what I need feedback or is what I need affirmation? Now, I have seen this so often, and I want to give you a specific story of a client that we worked with pretty recently. Now, this client had not only written a full draft of her memoir, in fact, she had worked with 2 different really well-known, really excellent quality writing coaches as she had worked through the process of both writing and revising. So on the surface, she was doing everything right. She had worked through the chaos house stage into just the messy house stage. Then she had gone through and looked at all 4 of those points, the things that make a good memoir, and they were all there for sure. But she'd still come to us and said, can you do a manuscript review for my manuscript? Now, if you're not familiar, a manuscript review is pretty similar to a developmental edit, but it tends to be a little bit more high level. With a manuscript review, we are going through and looking at the different pieces of your structure that are working really well. We're looking for the standout parts, sometimes of your prose or your imagery. We're looking to make sure that your topic and your message are really clear. All of the things that make a good memoir. And then at Page and Podium, we also always make sure that we, number 1, give you some kind of marketing advice and positioning advice, just so that you have that from us. But also number 2, give you really clear step-by-step instructions for the ways that you can improve the manuscript. Now, typically, when we get these manuscript review submissions, folks have just finished their first draft, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, why that may or may not be a good idea for you. But in this case, it was very clear from the start that we were not getting a messy first draft. that this was a very, very close to publishable book, if not already publishable. Now, as we worked through it, we were able to find, of course, some things that we felt that she could improve on. But what really struck me about this client is that when we sent our revision suggestions, they were pretty minor things. They were really polished, really kind of putting the sparkle on an already strong manuscript. She really wanted to hear much, much more from us. And in fact, when we met with her, what I found right away was that the problem of her manuscript was very much not the manuscript. The manuscript was essentially ready to go. The problem was that she did not have the trust in herself to know when her manuscript was ready. And I see this so much. I see this so much in my clients, in myself. It's really, really hard when you are taking something as personal as your story and pairing it with something that you want to be as powerful as your message, and yet somehow find the distance to have a sense of whether it's good or not. Oh, it's so hard, and I totally get why that is. But unfortunately, if what you are looking for is validation, if what you are looking for is confirmation that this book is good, I have some bad news for you. No one will ever be able to convince you of that until you convince yourself of that. Now, I know it's always much, much easier if outside people can tell us we're doing a good job. Everybody loves that bit of validation. It just feels really, really good. But what I don't want for you is to get so caught up in what others think about your book, in all of this feedback that you're getting, that you lose sight of what you were trying to do in the first place. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that as you go through the process of writing and revising a book, you are getting skills and training just through trial and error that most people never get. So when you are looking for this kind of validation, you really are skating on some thin ice, right? Because what I see is that very often authors will hand their books off for feedback to people who actually know significantly less than they do and hope that it will come back with a validation. But unfortunately, most of the time when you ask people for feedback, they will not give you affirmations. Most of the time, they will give you something that needs fixing. And that's why I want to talk very, very specifically today about how you can get the feedback that you need. Now, a couple of things before we get started. The first is, this is a little bit of a revisiting video because we have a pretty popular video from a while back on revising. So you can go back and find that either on the podcast, the blog, or this YouTube channel by looking for the How to Start Revising video. That's going to give you really a walkthrough of some of the first steps that can be applicable to most drafts. But we're going into much, much more detail here. And if you haven't listened to the first couple of episodes that we did in this series, it might be good to pause here and go back to that first one. Because one of the things that we really wanted to do with this series was get even more specific than that. So please make sure that you are really coming in here having a sense of kind of where you land. If you are, as from that video we mentioned, if you are a chaos house draft, I'll have very different advice for feedback than I would for someone that has a messy house kind of draft. So really do a little bit of work to be really, really honest with yourself, because that is going to help with this kind of balancing between really wanting feedback and maybe more wanting a little bit of validation. When you have a little bit more objective sense of where you are, that can really take care of a lot of the kind of strain and emotional struggle that you might feel. The second thing I want to mention, and stay tuned, please give me just a few seconds here. If you are someone who is revising and you would like more support, we do offer a revision option in the Memoir Method group program. And we've really put some time and a lot of thought into how we can really support authors who come to us with either full drafts of manuscripts or partial drafts of manuscripts. So we really can help you get the structure incorporated that is actually even harder when you're revising than it is when you're writing. So I hope that you will reach out and consider that program if you think it could help with some of this kind of support and guidance, and particularly this need for validation, because very often the validation can come from cheering you on as you're revising as opposed to the manuscript really needing to be validated or affirmed. And if that's the case, it's going to feel so much better for you to build up your self-trust through a community of support than to try sending your manuscript out until you get enough validation that you yourself believe it. Okay, so with that said, let me talk through some different ways that you can think about feedback as you are working on your draft. And the first one I want to mention might throw you for a loop. The first thing that I want to mention is getting feedback on your outline. Now, before you turn off this channel, I just want to say that I know if you are revising, you probably are well beyond your outline. But the reason I want to talk about this is that oftentimes we forget, once we have words on paper, that our outline is still the easiest way to see the 10,000-foot view of your book. And you need a 10,000-foot view if you're going to understand your book's structure. So when we're thinking about how to make sure that the pacing is moving forward of our book, that the book feels really cohesive and whole, that is a structural question. And it will be very, very difficult for you to get feedback on your full manuscript that has to do with structure, even when you're working with professional editors. That is our specialty at Page and Podium, so we put a lot of investment into making sure that your structure is strong. But I will tell you, this is not the case for every type of editor and every individual editor. So what do I mean when I say get feedback on your outline? Now, of course, the obvious application of this is that before you start writing, you can put together a detailed outline that just means about 100 words per chapter with a description of what will be happening in the story and your message for each chapter. If you have not started writing, I strongly recommend that you get some feedback on that work. When you have someone look at your outline, you often can make changes much more nimbly than if you try to do that after you have a full manuscript or even a partially written manuscript. But since you're here, I suspect that you are well beyond that point, so let's not focus there for any longer. But what I do want to say is in that first video of this series, we talked about some different types of drafts. And a couple of those drafts really benefit from putting your draft aside, locking it in your desk drawer, and doing another outline. So whether or not you had outlined to begin with, what I want you to think about is whether you can use the kind of knowledge and the in-depth thinking that you did to put together that draft to now go in and with that 10,000-foot view of all the work you've done, put together a new outline that you can then use to guide the revision process. It will help you organize those pieces you need to put together, help you kind of figure out where you need to flesh out, all that good stuff. And you also may be doing a reverse outline. Now, again, we have a whole video on how to reverse outline, but when you reverse outline, effectively what you're doing is going through piece by piece of your book and making a note of what you were doing at each stage. Now, if you want to get feedback on this, there's a really simple way to do that, and that is that rather than just leaving your reverse outline at kind of notes that are just for you, you can go ahead and make a reverse detailed outline. In fact, if you are hoping for a book deal, you will have to do this anyway. So why not dive right in? So what this means is going chapter by chapter and writing about 100 words, not of what you wish were there, but what you know are there. When you do that, you can hand that outline off and get some feedback on the structure. Now, one thing that I will tell you with all of these types of feedback is that anytime you are getting feedback, whether that is a professional or someone that you just know in your social circle, please make sure that you tell them what type of feedback you want. If you just leave people to their own devices, almost every single time you will have one of two outcomes. One outcome being they will tell you, it's great, I loved it. And the other outcome being that they will edit your grammar within an inch of its life. And neither of those are helpful really at all, right? So if you are doing this feedback on your outline or your reverse outline, I want you to be really clear about what you're looking for. So we have another video, this is a ways back, that's called How to Get Good Feedback on Your Draft. check that out because I'm going to give you 4 concrete questions that you can ask people to really make sure that the feedback that you get is really, really useful. But suffice it to say, for this video, if you are getting feedback on your outline, we know that that will be structural. So when you hand that outline off, it is worth telling the person that you do not need feedback on the prose. You don't need feedback on the grammar or the punctuation, things like that. What you are looking for is high-level feedback, feedback that's going to help you understand how the story works, how the structure works, how the flow feels, if there are confusing pieces, and that sort of thing. Okay, so the first thing I want you to think about is whether it's going to be useful for you to get feedback on your outline. And as I said, that is both an outline that you write before you get started writing and a reverse outline or an outline that you create after you have already kind of dumped all your ideas onto the page. All right, so once we have gotten feedback on that outline, the next thing that you're going to want to do is revise. Now, I know this sounds so obvious, but it is very, very tempting to get many, many rounds of feedback without taking the time in the middle to actually incorporate it. So do make sure that you have incorporated the feedback into your draft. And if what you find is you have not moved your draft from, say, chaos house into lopsided or chaos ideally into a messy house, that remember, you may still need to get some more feedback on the outline. We always want to make the most large, high-level structural changes first before we start to narrow down into the details. And this is why we always want to wait to the very, very end to do anything with the prose itself. At this point, we are focused on the structure. Okay, so once you have done that, you will know that you have a particular type of draft that needs a particular type of feedback. And I want to talk a little bit about how to know what you're looking for here. Now, in that first video of this series, I talked about these house metaphors, and that's what I've been referencing here. If it's all confusing to you, go back to that first video. It'll make much, much more sense. But what I want to talk about here is realizing that if you have, for instance, a lopsided house draft, or if you suspect you do, that will tell you a lot about the feedback you need. Now, you'll remember that a lopsided house is a draft that either has too much story and not enough message, too much message and not enough story, or very, very often, all story in the front half and all message in the back half. Now, of course, if you have that type of draft, it may be helpful to get feedback, but the particular type of feedback that you need is how to weave together the story and the message. You need to have a very, very clear sense of whether you are successful at teasing the message, at kind of getting your audience interested in where you're going from the very beginning. And I think this is a really helpful example because it can be applied to any of these types of drafts. So one piece of advice I give across the board to people who are looking for feedback is to be very, very specific about what type of feedback that you want. Now, once you have identified what type of draft you have, this is going to guide you on how you should move forward, right? Because with that lopsided draft, you are asking people to let you know, do you have a clear sense of what the topic is? Do you have a clear sense of the story, in other words? And do you have a clear sense of what the message is? Now, what I find is really helpful is rather than asking those as yes or no questions, ask them to tell you what the story is. Ask them to tell you what the message is. And what you will find will happen here is that you will get so much more richer data when you ask them to tell you as an open-ended question. Either the message they share with you will be spot on and you will know that you have nailed it, or the message that they share with you will not have really any resonance with what you were trying to do, or more likely somewhere in the middle, right? And once you have that feedback, now you know which aspects of that message you need to dial up and which you need to dial down. The same is true for your story. Ask the person that gives you feedback to tell you what the story is. Oftentimes, you will either find that, again, they've got the story, they understand exactly what you're trying to communicate, or they have all kinds of these other pieces of this story that they thought were important, but that you kind of meant as contextual details. And if that is the case, That tells you something really, really important about your story structure, right? That means that your structure is not built in a way that the story itself, the topic, is pulling people through, but rather you have maybe done some of this window dressing thing I've talked about a bit in this series, where you have really tried to add a lot of things that seemed exciting just to make your book seem really good and impressive. But if the feedback that you get is that all of these other pieces of story seem as important as your main story, well, that's helpful too, right? We know what we need to dial down and we know what we need to dial up. So I say that because even as you are getting feedback, after each round, I want you to really honestly evaluate for yourself which type of draft you have. Because truly, if you have a messy house draft, your feedback is very, very likely to serve you regardless of how you frame it to your reader. But if you have a chaos house, that reader will not be able to do anything with your manuscript. No non-professional editor, and actually many professional editors, will really not be able to do any of this work for you of helping you put your chaos house together. That just unfortunately is a big piece of author-based revision that you're gonna have to tackle either on your own or with support from someone like a writing coach or Memoir Method, a group program like that. Okay, so now that we have kind of thought about getting this feedback, incorporating the feedback, reevaluating what type of draft we have so that we can give really specific instructions for our feedback folks, the next thing we need to think about is how we are going to process that feedback. Yes, we are going to need to process it. Here's the thing that happens so often, and I find especially with high achieving women, when we get feedback, very often we are going to take it so deeply to heart that we will really have trouble kind of separating out what we agree with and what we don't. And this goes double if you hand off your manuscript to someone who is red pen happy. So here's what I want to tell you. When folks are reading, what they are doing is comparing your draft with published, finished books that they read. And this is one of the issues with having non-professional readers give you feedback. I will never tell you, by the way, that you shouldn't do that. I just want you to keep in mind that they do not have a basis of comparison of what a draft at the stage of your book looks like. Of course they don't. Most people don't, right? So what you are likely to get is not necessarily feedback on whether your manuscript is good, whether parts of it are working or not. What you are getting is your reader reaction, of course. And sometimes that will be aligned, but sometimes it won't. And what I want to tell you is that every single piece of feedback from every single person that you get feedback from is all up for debate. And you know who you debate it with? Yourself. So this is why in this last revision video, I made such a big deal about self-trust, because truly you are the person that has to decide whether the feedback is helpful. And let me kind of give you some examples here, because I think it's going to help you kind of see that, number one, if you get a lot of red pen feedback, you are not alone at all. And two, I really want you to kind of be ready for the types of things that people will share. So the most common piece of reactionary feedback I find is that people will have some particular scene or chapter in your book that they actually really connected with, and because they connected with it, they want you to do a whole bunch of stuff to it. So maybe they liked a particular moment and they want you to make it more exciting. Maybe they didn't like a particular character and you wish that you wouldn't focus on them so much. Maybe they thought that your message was really, really powerful and they wanted more of it. And in all of these cases, that feedback is not about you at all. That feedback is about them. Now, I want to just kind of head off something that I think might be coming up for some of you folks, and that is, if a reader gives me feedback, isn't it valid feedback? And the answer is yes, and also no. So all feedback is valid feedback, right? People are usually trying their best. They are saying what they really, truly, and honestly think. And yet, feedback that will take your book in a direction that is not the direction you want to go in is just simply not valid feedback for you. Doesn't mean that the person didn't give you good enough feedback. It doesn't mean that there was anything wrong with them. What it means is it is more important for you to keep sight and hold of your vision than it is for you to necessarily cater to every single individual person's feedback. We are not people pleasing here. We are trying to make our manuscript better, and that is so, so, so important. So one thing that I want to tell you is that even when you get to the stage when you are working with a publisher, even if you have a book contract at a traditional press, you are allowed to push back on feedback. And in fact, I don't know any author that's published traditionally that hasn't pushed back on at least one piece of feedback. Now, let me kind of give you an example of this because I think it might be really helpful. When I was working on my second book, there was a piece of the argument that the reviewers, it went to a couple of different people to review it, and there was a piece of the argument that the reviewers really, really liked. They wanted more of it. And in fact, one thing that they suggested was that I incorporate a new case study chapter. Now, if you want to read that book, that is great. It's called Culturally Speaking. It is out there. But it is more of an academic book, and it is based on a series of different case studies. So when the reviewers saw it, there were 3 case studies, and they suggested that I add a 4th. Oh, now you can imagine what this did to my heart, because you think you're done at this stage, and they're telling me to write new material. Oh my gosh. Well, they had suggested a couple of case studies, and I'm sure that they would have been great. But as I thought about it, the more I realized that the topic they wanted me to expand on was something I'd actually already written on. And in fact, I'd already kind of written a piece that really addressed that feedback. So I called my editor and I did not say, oh my gosh, those dumb reviewers, how dare they say this to me? But what I did say was, I can totally see where they're coming from. And I think I even understand the issue that they're pointing at. I think that what they're asking for is more explanation of XYZ topic. But what if, instead of the case studies that they suggested, I incorporate this piece that I did on Adele and expand it, make it a little bit more weighty, give it a little more kind of oomph. And what if we do that and kind of see if that satisfies the reviewers? And what do you know? It absolutely did. Because when you get feedback, there is a particular art to reading it in a way that does not take your reviewers literally. Your reviewers are trying to be helpful. They are suggesting specific fixes, but you are the author, and you are responsible not for executing every piece of advice, but rather for taking that advice and really thinking about what that person saw that prompted them to give you that advice. Very, very often, it is something different than what the person said. And this is a time that it is perfectly acceptable and even desirable to push back on the feedback. So that is the first thing. If you see that you are getting some reactionary feedback, if you feel like you don't agree with it, you do not have to do it. You do need to address the thing that was prompting that suggestion, but you are under no obligation to execute every piece of feedback that you get from every person that has an opinion on your book. You simply aren't. Okay, one more extension I want to offer for you when you are getting this reactionary feedback. I really want to make sure that you have some support that is not feedback. So what I mean by that is that oftentimes when we get this feedback, it can really hurt. When we are talking about getting feedback on a memoir in particular, it can feel so, so personal. And one thing that I want to assure you is that no matter what anyone says about your book, you are worthy as a human and your story is worth telling. It does not matter what anyone says. But that's really hard to hold on to when you're getting especially this kind of reactionary red pen feedback. It can really often feel just totally demoralizing. And that is why when you move into this feedback stage, I really want you to consider having some additional support. And yes, this is just cheerleaders. So I am giving you permission to seek out some kind of unqualified support, some folks that are on your team, on your side, and most importantly, who believe in what you're doing. Because those folks are going to be so necessary as you are wading through whether or not you agree or disagree with particular pieces of feedback. And in fact, oftentimes, if you take a piece of feedback that's really bugging you to one of your support system, just telling them what the feedback was is going to give you so much more clarity than when you're sitting alone looking at that email and really feeling sad. So do not be demoralized. And in fact, please be proactive about this so that you have someone to turn to if that revision suggestion starts to really hurt. I don't want that. It's not good for you. It's not good for your project. It's not good for your creativity. It's just bad all around. Okay, and my last tip is I really want, as you are moving through this feedback, I really hope that you will think about being really deliberate about the amount of feedback. And here's what I mean by this. So often we will get into this stage where we are handing off our manuscript and asking for feedback. And then it comes back, and then we execute those revisions, and then we send that draft back. So this very, very often will happen, by the way, with professional feedback with an editor, because we want to see if we did what they asked, right? We want to get their sign off. Now, some of this comes back to this need that we all have for validation. We really just want someone to look at what we did and say, yes, you did it, A+, gold star. Truly, this is where it comes from, right? This education system idea that we really need someone else's approval to say we did a good job. But it's totally understandable. The thing that I want to point out, though, is that we can very easily fall into an infinite loop of feedback when we get into that path. So we send our manuscript off for feedback, we get that feedback back, we incorporate it, we send it back for feedback, we get the feedback back, we incorporate it, and we can do this forever. So obviously, this is a bad place to be in, not only because I want you to actually get this book out, and if you get caught in an infinite feedback loop, you may never, but also because every single manuscript comes to a point where feedback is as likely to make the manuscript worse as it is to make the manuscript better. And I am not being dramatic here. I have literally seen this happen. So as you are seeking feedback, I want you to be really, really clear about what type of feedback you are looking for. What do you need to know about your manuscript? Because if it is, the manuscript is good, that is a very particular type of reader that you need. Probably it's you, by the way, but it's a particular type of reader. And if what you need is structural feedback, you know, not everyone can give that to you. If what you want is prose feedback, that doesn't come at the beginning, right? We know we need to wait for the revisions to be done before we get the prose feedback, and so on and so forth. And when we are very, very clear about what we're looking for, we will be so much better prepared to actually execute it and finish it in a way that feels really, really good. Okay, as you are moving through this revision process, I really hope that you can find some way to reconnect with your authentic voice. So often this feedback stage, this revision stage, is a point at which we start to really lose ourselves. And truly, as you are getting feedback, whether that is from your outline or your full draft, the most important thing is that you stay grounded in your vision and purpose for this book. Other people's feedback simply can never take that into account as much as you would like it to. Now, if you are at a point where you have done the revisions that you feel you can do and you are ready for some professional feedback, I do want to let you know that we have manuscripts available through Page and Podium. I would love to have the opportunity to take a look at your book, to write up a really simple, easy to follow guide for how to revise it. And then as part of all of our manuscript reviews, we also, of course, include an hour session with Emily or I, depending on who has dug into your manuscript, to really just go through what you have to do and make a strategic plan for doing it. We never want you to feel alone. We never want you to feel abandoned, and we certainly do not want you to feel demoralized. So we are always sure that we are honest with you and also kind. It's kind of my brand, right? Okay, well, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so excited for next week's episode when we will talk about revision as a process. This is going to be the final installment in our 4-part series on revision, and I know it's going to give you a lot of clarity about how much you need to be doing at each stage in your revisions. But until then, I hope your revision is going well. Happy writing and happy revising. know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.